together again for a question and answer session with Dr. Bride, who led us so well in a training a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Bride is the professor and director of the School of Social Work at Georgia State University. He actually developed the secondary traumatic stress scale and has received numerous honors as a result of his research in this area, including the Creative Research Medal from the University of Georgia. He received his MSW from Florida State University, his MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health, and his PhD from the University of Georgia. So good morning to everyone, and I'll turn it over to Jacob Lambeck to start the question and answer session. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Erin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for being here with us today. My name is Jacob Lambeck. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Georgia's Masters of Public Administration program, and I currently serve in a supporting role with the Athens Area Community Foundation, the Athens Wellbeing Project, and Envision Athens to help carry out the administrative work tied to this grant. Dr. Bride, if you're ready, we did receive quite a number of questions from the Google form where we were collecting them. So if that's good with you, I'll just start rattling them off.
Sounds good.
All right. So there were a couple of questions related to what counts or doesn't count as trauma. Some examples include can or do childhood seizures constitute a traumatic event? And does the loss of a close friend at a young age in a violent manner constitute a traumatic event?
So yes and no. So each of those could represent a traumatic event. I think the important thing to remember is that what classifies something as a traumatic event is not just the event itself, but how it's experienced by the individual, and then what effects that has on them. So yes, both of those events could be traumatic depending on how the individual who is experiencing them, how they view it and how they interpret it. So seizures are not generally a potential cause of death. They can be, but generally not. But certainly that first one for an individual who's experiencing it or witnessing it could very well feel like that. So so I would say in both cases, it's really a big, the piece is really how does the individual experience it? Do they interpret it as a threat to life or physical safety or their physical integrity?
Thank you. So this is a bit of a lengthy question, but I'll just read it verbatim here because I think it gives some good background to the question. I'm not a health professional or a social worker, and my job does not typically involve counseling, but I work with our company's wellness program. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for how to utilize this information in my job. I was thinking about doing a lunch and learn with a professional, appropriate for an office setting, and ideally with an option for remote attendance. My thought would be to focus on the definitions of trauma as a way to A, help people identify trauma that they themselves may have experienced, and B, to provide some guidance for anyone who lives with, cares for, or is close to someone who has experienced a traumatic event.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfectly good idea. You know, and one of the ideas behind these sessions that we're holding is that it's not necessarily for health professionals or social service providers, but for the general community as well. And so in that setting, I think it makes sense to do some training specifically around just exactly what the person has said. What are the basics of trauma? What does it look like? I think because that's the very bare minimum for becoming a trauma-informed organization and a trauma-informed individual. So I think the more people are trauma-informed in different aspects of life in the community, then that's best.
Thank you. Is there a best practice to prepare to face traumatic situations or to mitigate the effects of trauma before an event occurs if you can foresee it coming?
That's a great question. So we haven't really been able to identify great preventative measures in the face of an upcoming trauma or expectation of trauma. We can't really prevent traumas, unfortunately, they occur. But that being said, remember we talked a bit about resiliency and post-traumatic growth. So resiliency factors really do help mitigate the negative impact of traumatic events. And the resiliency factors are ones that we would carry with us, and they develop over time. So the interaction of the traumatic event and where we are with various resiliency factors can really determine that a great deal. Remember, resiliency factors have to do with the individual as well as the community and social support. And so really engaging in a social support network is probably the thing that's the easiest to really cultivate and to engage in, and to have a support network.
Thank you. Thinking about secondary traumatic stress for a moment, what role, if any, do the media and movies play as they portray events and disasters, often very violent events?
So there's been some research in the impact of media exposure on traumatic events that definitely indicates that though it's exposure through media may be less traumatizing in the sense that fewer people are negatively impacted by it, it can be a mechanism of trauma exposure. Then the other layer is that I think was built into the question for individuals who have already experienced trauma, or either primary or secondary trauma. Depictions in the media or in movies and TV can exacerbate or even trigger some symptoms. So I'm not, journalism's out of my area of expertise. So I can't really comment on the ethics and what we should do. What I think it is important to do is as individuals who may have experienced trauma, either directly or indirectly in our lives, titrating or moderating our own exposure to those sorts of experiences is really important. So in some of my work with social workers and healthcare providers, one of the things that comes up very often is the importance of really regulating what sorts of TV shows and what sorts of movies one watches. I often point to, which is one of my favorite shows, Law and Order SVU. For many people, that's not a good show to unwind the day with. But that being said, I've also heard from people who are in these fields who will say, in some ways, those experiences can be cathartic, in that, well, with SVU often, there's consequences that are played out, and that can help with some of the resolution. So what's really important, I think, is for the individual to really self-regulate, be aware of where they are with those sorts of things. And I think in terms of movies and TVs, I think many people really are, and they self-select whether they know why that is or not. I think one of the challenges in today's society is the kind of the 24-hour news cycle and the depictions on news. And as we all know, we can control that in our house, but when we engage in the world, TVs are on, go get your car serviced and the news is on, you go anywhere else, the news is on, and on the radio. So, if it's bothersome, I do think it's important to kind of turn that off, and do some self-protection around that.
Great, excellent, thank you. So I guess with tied sort of to the media here and current U.S. events, we had a couple of questions related to current events in relation to experiences of racism. So how can we best begin to offer trauma-informed care that addresses some of the concerns around the nation of racism and oppression, especially for those who may have been directly impacted by something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the last few weeks have been really hard for all of us, or to experience. And as that question points out, it adds a whole another layer of complexity to even to what we were trying to accomplish around trauma-informed communities and care. There is a whole area of research around race-based trauma, trauma based on one's racial experiences. Robert Carter at Columbia does a lot of that work. There are a number of people out there who do that. And it's I would say it's akin to I mean, it is essentially when we were talking about historical and intergenerational traumas. That's part of it. It's a collective trauma. I think, you know, from what I'm experiencing and engaging in the worlds that I engage in, is that for good or for bad, I think the impact of what's going on now is much broader than it has been in the past. So I think there's becoming to be wider recognition of the psychological and social toll of race-based violence and selective policing and those sorts of things. Frankly, you know, we're in the midst of it, so it's kind of hard to talk about. I mean, I think many of us are kind of trying to figure out how to deal with it as well. But I think going back to the question, part of it is to, you know, being trauma informed includes being informed about that historical and intergenerational aspect of trauma and how that can interact with a specific traumatic event as well, and being culturally aware, being trauma informed around those aspects of what's going on.
Great, thank you. Let's see, a couple of last questions here. Hi, superb work, Dr. Bride. I'm a social care student. I was only saying 1 week before the training that I needed some trauma-informed education. The first question, what are some of the best ways to console or comfort a person who has experienced trauma and or historical abuse?
So, I mean, the core piece is being empathic and being a support and listening without judgment and without re-traumatizing the individual. So by that last piece would be, you know, to be supportive of an individual who's experienced a trauma, particularly a recent trauma. It's important to let them guide the conversation in the sense of it's not helpful at all to them for us to be probing for details and reacting with horror at what they're telling us. That being said, if the individual brings stuff up and wants to process it, then that's where they are and that's what they need. That's okay. And so the idea is to really just be empathic and supportive of the individual. It can be actually harmful if we try to force the issue in terms of saying you have to process this with me, or you really need to talk about and get it out. Processing and having exposure to that processing activity can really be helpful in the healing process, but it has to be at the time that individual is ready. So forcing that on them is the big do not do aspect of that.
Great, and I think sort of potentially connected to your response on that question. The second question is the legal route of the victim reporting abuses important to recovery in your experience, or have you found that the prosecution process can often be re-traumatizing?
Yeah, I think that similar to a couple other answers, it's really individually based. that process can be helpful in gaining closure and vindication, but absolutely part of the process often is re-traumatizing. And so part of that's, what we're trying to do is trauma-inform the world, right? So trauma-informed justice systems are really important. So it's a yes/no answer, yes and no. The potential for re-traumatization is there, but so is the potential for gaining justice as a healing factor.
Thank you. And we are nearing the end of our questions here. One last one to wrap it up. If you could provide one major takeaway related to trauma or trauma-informed care, one major thing that you think everyone should know and take away from this opportunity, what would that be?
I think probably awareness of the great prevalence of trauma, in the sense that recognizing that many people who we interact with on a day-to-day basis have experienced trauma, and it's important to understand how that may play out in their behaviors in our interaction with them. So it's really to be trauma sensitive, I think, is really probably the key takeaway. Be aware of what it is, be aware how it may impact individuals and their relationships and interactions with us, and be sensitive to that aspect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bride. We've got about 18 people on the phone call this morning. Everybody who's on the phone at this time, you are more than welcome to use the chat function to ask additional questions. The purpose of this coffee and conversation was to provide some follow-up and opportunity to debrief or ask additional questions from our May 28th trauma-informed care training. I'll put the YouTube link for that training back in the chat box in just a minute. But thinking about your roles in the community or your organizations or yourself as a human, if you have questions related to promoting trauma-informed care work, personally or professionally, drop it in the chat box. Dr. Bride, Mr. Doherty is asking, could you talk a little bit more about resiliency factors?
Sure, and that's probably something we could do another 3-hour training on itself. So what we have found over time and through research is that not everyone who experiences traumatic events or particularly even just a series of traumatic events and adverse childhood experiences and negative experiences in their life are that doesn't make someone predestined to have negative outcomes themselves, either through mental health outcomes or negative behavioral outcomes. So I think I would say there's a point in time in the past where the assumption was if someone experiences a lot of adverse events, that it's going to cause problems for them. What research has shown is that's not necessarily the case, that many people who experience adverse experiences and traumatic events in the end turn out just, they return to normal, or they even grow and thrive from that experience. Not to say that there aren't challenges in getting there. And so through looking at this, we realized that there are different aspects of individual characteristics and community characteristics that help with that resiliency process. Individually, it's really about, which I say individually is the one that as individuals we can most control to a certain degree. So it has to do with kind of the way individuals view the world. So having kind of a positive, not Pollyanna-ish, but a positive aspect of moving forward and looking at challenges and adverse events as challenges and as opportunities to grow, having a sense of acceptance that things happen and I'm going to work through them, and a sense of being persevering through struggle. Of particular importance, which I think I already said, is having a social support network. But honestly, in terms of resiliency factors, that may come down to a single individual. So what's really been demonstrated through the resiliency research is that individuals having even just a single person who is supportive and strong and can be a mentor and social support can really change the trajectory of traumatic experiences and adverse childhood experiences. And so that may or may not be a friend or a family. I mean, obviously there would be a friend aspect to it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a family member or a friend. It can be someone in the community. It can be, someone that you work with, someone that you go to church with, someone that you just experience the world with as well. So from our own ability to develop some resiliency, it's practicing some of those aspects. Some of this is skills and experiences we can nurture and make happen through the way we look at the world and mindfulness practice, as well as certainly being active in developing a social support network. Community factors are certainly more difficult to have an individual impact on, but certainly that's not to say that we shouldn't do that. But having a community that has resources that for that social support and has models of people who embody some of the individual resiliency factors is particularly important.
Dr. B, thank you. I wrote down resiliency as some possibility for future trainings as well. We have a couple more questions. Beth is asking, could you speak a little bit more to the frontline workers in schools, people, employees such as teachers, bus drivers, custodial staff, those who may have trauma awareness but no structural supports for providing trauma-informed care? So less of a question and more, could you speak to frontline workers in school systems, teachers, bus drivers, custodial workers who have trauma awareness but no structural supports to providing trauma-informed care? Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest challenges we face right now in terms of developing trauma-informed systems, I think, is the focus tends to be on frontline workers who would have those experiences rather than those around them or those in settings that weren't traditionally looked at as needing trauma-informed care. What's really required is a shift in organizational culture in a lot of these settings towards trauma-informed care, and particularly towards secondary traumatic stress-informed employment. So the first step, obviously, is the awareness aspect of that. Part of what I'm thinking when I see this question is that it's been a big move forward that we're talking about trauma-informed schools more recently and talking about secondary trauma within schools. Some of my work has become around that, where for years I've thought about education as a primary place where particularly teachers may experience secondary trauma, but there just hasn't been any recognition of that. But that is starting to change, and it starts with that change. In the social service sphere and social work and child welfare, for instance, I've been doing this work for 25 years around secondary trauma. And, at the beginning, these social work and child welfare didn't really recognize to a great extent how trauma within the work setting and how trauma infected individuals and communities as much. And so there's been a great change in that, where those organizations and those systems are really starting to look at the systemic and organizational factors that need to be put into place to support their workers, both frontline workers as well as auxiliary workers. And so I say that as to point out that I think there's hope and change, but it's really pushing that envelope, pushing those systems to make those changes. It has happened and it was in the process of happening in some spheres where it's been more obvious, but education is, I think, probably one of the most important areas where we really need to be pushing this agenda of both trauma-informed care and secondary trauma-informed services.
That's great. Thank you so
And
much.
I really want to highlight that Beth's delivery of that is, bus drivers, custodial staff, reception staff, the folks who we don't think of as being as directly dealing with students or individuals within our workplace, they still hear what's going on. They see what's going on. They experience it. So they are indirectly being exposed to that trauma, even though we may not think so. So we need to really be aware that that's what's going on. And I mean, I would say there are a number of places where the professionals feel supported, but the paraprofessionals and the support staff are not. And that needs to change as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. So much opportunity for this work in a variety of settings. We have a question in the chat box. Much of history tells ways people of color have been traumatized, but those are not reflected in history books and sources. Where do you steer individuals interested in a deeper dive on that subject matter? I think you touched on some work Columbia did. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Robert Carter is a faculty member, I think, in the College of Education at Columbia University, but he's a psychologist by training, and he has written a number of articles around race-based trauma. And in fact, he's developed a measure to develop race-based, to measure traumatic stress symptoms based on race-based exposure to that. So this is a fairly new area in that the research rather than the discussion of it. I mean, I think the discussion is behind as well, but there is some research beginning to emerge that really identifies race-based experiences as potentially traumatic. Going back to what we talked about is what is traumatic. I mean, again, it's an event that is experienced by an individual as traumatic and then has lasting effects. And I have a hard time seeing how some racial interactions I've seen couldn't be experienced as traumatic. I mean, to me, I say that to say there's no question to me that that these can be traumatic experiences even without violence. And it's one of the kind of areas that we have to pressure or really talk about and legitimize as an area that's very real. The history of secondary trauma research, for instance, is that it was initially kind of dismissed as you can't be traumatized indirectly, right? So now we have a lot of research that very much supports that that's not the case, that indirect trauma occurs. And that's where the research around racial-based trauma is going. It's really documenting the impacts so that we can start having that conversation and look at ways to intervene and to interact with society that can change that.
Thank you so much. It's interesting to hear. It sounds to me from what you're saying that much of the research and work around race-based trauma-informed care work is very new.
Yeah, it's fairly new. And I want to be very careful about, I don't want to put what's going on in the country right now I don't really want to put it in any positive light, but if there is some part of it is that it's pushing the envelope on this, making this more of an object of discussion, and that I think will be helpful. I wish we had gotten there without what's going on, but But I do hope that that's one of the outcomes of what we're going through, is that there'll be much more discussion of this issue.
Thank you. I will personally be taking a look at Dr. Robert Carter with the College of Education at Columbia University, who's done some extensive work on race-based trauma. Please, if I've missed a question or you have additional questions, feel free to use the chat box. My name is Sarah McKinney. I'm the president and CEO of the Athens Area Community Foundation. I'm working with Dr. Bride and Jacob Lambeck and our Envision Athens and Athens Wellbeing Project to bring trauma-informed care programs to the Northeast Georgia area to better make new champions. We've had a lot of great champions in our community around trauma-informed, but we're really working to make sure that every corner of our communities have access to trauma-informed care trainings. We have another question from Jen Wellborn. Where can she find more information on post-traumatic growth?
Post-traumatic growth is a topic that's been it's been out there for a while, so there's been a lot of writing on it. You literally could probably just Google that and find some basic information. There is a book. The originators, the people who really started to push this concept and identify it, are Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who are, I think both, or at least one of them, is out of UNC Charlotte. But there's several books around it. There's lots of websites that begin to address it as well. So I literally would just say just Google it. Their work is pretty tremendous. It really changed the field of traumatology in a sense that it helped move us from really looking at the negative impacts of trauma, but to recognizing that we need to also focus on the positive outcomes that could come and how those can be leveraged to really mitigate the negative aspects.
That's great. Jen, thank you for that question. Tracy, thank you for your questions. Beth and Jim, if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Dr. Bride, knowing that we had a ton of individuals on that May 28th trauma training, we've had many people view the YouTube link that I shared since then. Is there any just kind of last words or nuggets of wisdom that you would have for us on this call about what it means to think about? For me personally, I'm new on the scene for understanding trauma. I think we all inherently understand it, but I mean new on the scene in terms of what it means to be trauma informed as an individual and how I carry that in the work I do and in my personal life. Do you have any last kind of nuggets of wisdom for us on this call?
I think it's just important to recognize that awareness varies from time to time. So that's part of what we need to do, is be mindful of how we think about trauma and how we think about individuals that we're interacting with and whether we're using that lens. But perhaps the piece I really would want to leave people with is the importance of self-care, importance of taking care of yourself in any time, but certainly in these particularly challenging times, that we can't help people if we're not fully functional ourselves. And so it's really important that we engage in various self-care activities.
Thank you so much. Self-care, 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 self-care.
Right.
Repeat. We have a question from Bridget. She says, good morning to everybody. And Dr. Bride, can you speak more on the responses to trauma, such fight, flight, or freeze, appease, collapse? She works at University Counseling Services and has to often tell survivors of rape and sexual assault about responses, and then also teach students about the responses. For example, oftentimes students do not understand why a survivor did not fight or scream. Can you touch a little bit on individual responses to trauma?
Yeah, so what this is really asking about is as the trauma is occurring. Bridget points to exactly what it is. We have a physiological fight, flight, freeze response in to traumatic or very threatening situations. And frankly, that's to a good bit not under our direct control. It's how our bodies and how our minds immediately react, and everyone varies on that. So there's individual reactions. So it's really inappropriate to kind of place judgment or meaning on whether someone freezes or flees, for instance. And though that a big part of that is unconscious, then the individual is making split-second decisions in that moment based on stimuli and feedback that are coming at them very fast during a period where they're experiencing these very significant physiological reactions to what they're experiencing. So I think another piece, because that's talking about the around educating others around why someone didn't fight or scream or flee, is to just we have to help people understand that there's individualized responses. There's no wrong response that a victim can have. I mean, I just can't see that a victim should ever be blamed or questioned about how they responded. They responded the way their body and their mind in the immediate experience had to react to survive. And so I agree. I mean, I think it's hard for some people to understand why that's the case, why someone might freeze rather than fight. But it's really about physiology and the immediacy of the impact.
One of our registrants shared a link in the chat box from the National Institute for Justice. I think that yes, the National Institute for Justice, on some instruction related to the neurobiology of trauma and sexual assault. Seems to be a great online resource. So if you want to grab that, that's in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and that helps. I mean, thinking about this session a few weeks ago, and that's an area that we probably should have covered more. That tends to I tend to think of more for professionals, but the neurobiology of trauma, there's been so much research in the past 10 years around that, if not 20 years, that really demonstrates that that there's a physiological, visceral response that's completely out of our control. And that those physiological responses really do impact how we experience trauma and how we heal. And so I think that's something that's really important, that people who are interacting with others with trauma recognize that it's not simply an emotional response but there's a real physiological basis to it.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any additional questions they'd like to ask of Dr. Bride? Dr. Bride has been so incredible to share his expertise in our community over the last several weeks. And I know he's an incredible resource, local, statewide, and nationwide. We had a great follow-up attendance this morning and some exceptional questions posed pre-coffee and conversation, as well as this morning. I'm just kind of going on, lingering just a moment to see if anybody has anything in the chat box they'd like to add. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat box as well. We're building out future trauma-informed care trainings for our communities. And if you have any suggestions for future trainings, we'd love to have your input. Jim, thank you so much. Jim's asking if we can do a session on resiliency. And I think absolutely, based on this call alone, that would warrant some opportunity. So we'll keep everybody on this call and from the May 28th training informed on our next steps. But I do think a session on resiliency would be very, very appropriate for this group. Jacob, any last thoughts for you as I type in my information here?
No, that's all for me. Just want to thank everyone again for coming today. I'm really glad that we received all these questions and that we had the opportunity to follow up with Dr. Bride. Thank you, Dr. Bride, for sharing your time and expertise with us. I think we've only had a few hours, but I think it's really gone a long way in informing this community about trauma-informed care in a really meaningful way.
Great. Thank you. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you. I know today the thing I learned the most, and I think I sort of understood this, but I'm really taking away from this call for me personally, was if somebody's sharing experiences with you, to not, to bring the empathy there, but not necessarily to force that you have to get it out. Let's talk about it, but that listening piece that is more critical than ever in our society would be so critical when you're listening to somebody share experience. And I will really remember that from this morning's training and appreciate that. You got lots of thank yous in the chat box, Dr. Bride.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yes, thank you all so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and clearly we have plenty of interest in continuing this work. So thank you all. Have a great day today. I'll place this recording on YouTube, and I hope you all stay safe and healthy as well. Thank you so much. We stop the recording.